Flaxborough prided itself on being moderately festive, which was the safest kind of festive to be. The annual Halloween charity ball, held in the rather self-satisfied assembly rooms, offered an ideal mixture of merriment and moral justification. The mayor, whose costume as Count Dracula suffered from an excess of starch, had opened the evening with a short speech about seasonal goodwill. Mrs. Glossop, who organised the affair and most other things worth organising in Flaxborough, nodded approvingly as she circulated among the guests. The decorations were elaborate in a way that suggested both enthusiasm and anxiety. Pumpkins with identical grins, cobwebs that looked too clean to be convincing, and a scattering of black balloons that sighed softly whenever someone passed. There was apple bobbing in one corner, a raffle in another, and a buffet which would later lead to quiet digestive regrets. Shortly after 9, just as the raffle was being announced, a new guest arrived. She, or at least her shape suggested as much, was tall, graceful, and dressed entirely in black velvet. A simple silver mask covered her face, catching the light each time she turned her head. She did not give her name at the door, which the doorman assumed meant she was of some importance. Mrs. Glossop, seeing her from across the hall, decided it must be the wife of one of the councillor's cousins, and therefore above question. Conversation slowed wherever the masked figure passed. She spoke little, accepted a glass of punch without tasting it, and seemed to observe rather than join the festivities. The music swelled and faltered, the mayor tripped on his cloak, and the raffle was won by the vicar's wife again. No one noticed the silent guests slip away. When the lights brightened for the tidy-up, Mrs. Glossop discovered a small black handbag beneath a chair near the dais. It was tasteful, expensive, and faintly perfumed. Inside lay a folded invitation to the ball, conspicuously blank where the name should have been. She frowned, certain it was a prank, and placed it on her mantle that night to consider over cocoa. By morning, however, the matter had grown larger than her intentions. In telling her neighbour, strictly in confidence, she had set in motion the machinery of Flaxborough conversation. By the time the milk arrived, the town knew that a mysterious woman had attended the ball uninvited, that she had carried a handbag full of strange papers, and that the police were already involved. The police, as it happened, were not. Inspector Purbright first heard of the affair from Sergeant Love, who arrived at his office bearing a copy of the Flaxborough Citizen. The front page featured a grainy photograph of Mrs. Glossop holding the handbag like a captured relic. Beneath it, the headline asked, "Who was the mystery guest?" Purbright read the article twice, folded the paper with care, and regarded Love with mild amusement. "You see, Love, it takes very little to make our town feel interesting to itself." Love grinned. "Shall I fetch Mrs. Glossop in, sir?" Purbright shook his head. No, we'll go to her. She'll be expecting it, and the expectation is often more revealing than the conversation." Outside, the late October fog lay thick over the streets, softening every outline. Flaxborough looked perfectly innocent, which Purbright knew from experience was not the same as harmless. As the constable started the car, Purbright glanced once more at the newspaper photograph. The masked guest, blurred and indistinct, stood at the edge of the dance floor, turned slightly away from the camera, as though shy of being remembered. "Curious thing, Love," he said quietly. "People are never so visible as when they try to disappear." The car moved off through the mist. Somewhere in the quiet town, a handbag waited on a mantelpiece, a mask lay discarded, and a very small mystery had begun to stir the comfortable dust of Flaxborough's respectability. By the time Inspector Purbright and Sergeant Love reached Mrs. Glossop's neat red-brick house in Tennyson Avenue, the town had already decided on 3 entirely different explanations for the mysterious guest. The postmistress maintained it was a publicity stunt for next month's amateur dramatics. The butcher favoured a more sinister theory involving a jilted lover, while Miss Tidy from the library, always imaginative, suggested the guest had been an undercover journalist from the Sunday Clarion. Each explanation, naturally, had been delivered with absolute conviction and a tone implying personal knowledge of those involved. Mrs. Glossop greeted the policeman in her lilac dressing gown, clearly prepared for them. Her sitting room was heavy with the scent of lavender polish and civic responsibility. On the mantel, the handbag rested like a sacred object, flanked by two porcelain dogs that seemed to guard it from further impropriety. "I'm so glad you've come," she said, settling herself carefully into a chair that already bore the imprint of authority.
"I do hope this isn't going to be turned into a scandal."
"You know what people are like." Purbright inclined his head. "Indeed, Mrs. Glossop, we rely on it to keep the town alive. Perhaps you might tell us how the bag came into your possession." She did, at considerable length and with small revisions whenever she felt her earlier phrasing had lacked dignity. The mysterious woman had been polite, almost too polite, had spoken little, and had seemed to know precisely when to disappear. Mrs. Glossop had, she said, felt something not quite right, though she had been too busy to act upon it at the time. Sergeant Love took notes while trying to appear neither sceptical nor amused. When Mrs. Glossop produced the handbag, Purbright inspected it with careful indifference. It was good leather, modestly expensive, containing nothing beyond a handkerchief, a mirror,
"And the nameless invitation. No initials," he murmured.
"And nothing personal except perhaps the perfume." He closed the clasp with a soft click. "You haven't touched the contents, Mrs. Glossop?" "Only to confirm they were, well, ordinary."
"I did think there might be a card or something helpful for you." "There often is," said Purbright pleasantly.
"Though rarely the one we expect." When they left, the street had grown busier with people who appeared to have sudden errands involving their front gardens. A window blind across the road trembled once and was still.
Love noticed it.
"They're watching, sir." "Of course," Purbright replied. "They'd be disappointed if we solved it too quickly. Mystery is a rare luxury in Flaxborough." At the station that afternoon, the telephone rang steadily with offers of information. Most were well-meaning fabrications. One caller swore she had seen the masked guest buying stamps. Another claimed she recognized the perfume as the sort used by certain theatrical women. Purbright listened with patience, thanked each contributor, and made no notes at all. The only remark he made came after the fifth call, when he leaned back and observed, "It's remarkable how quickly the imagination supplies identity when the face is hidden." By evening, the Citizen had issued a second edition. The front-page gossip now hinted that the handbag had contained documents of significance, which caused the vicar's wife to write a stern letter denying any connection to espionage. The mayor, meanwhile, expressed concern that the incident might discourage respectable participation in civic events. Purbright spent the end of the day by the window of his office, watching the fog creep back over the lamplit square. Somewhere beyond it, he knew, someone was enjoying the growing confusion just a little too much. The ball, the mask, the invitation, each detail had the careful tidiness of a plan meant to seem accidental. He turned from the window. "Love," he said quietly, "find out if anyone in the past fortnight has made inquiries about hiring costumes, masks or cloaks. Start with the Theatre Society, then the fancy dress shop in Market Lane. Think she's local, sir?" "I think," said Purbright, with that mildness which meant he was thinking very hard indeed, "that Flaxborough has acquired a guest it didn't expect, and perhaps one it deserves." Love grinned, half in confusion. "And what shall I tell people if they ask what we've found?" Purbright smiled faintly. "Tell them the investigation is progressing beautifully. It always sounds reassuring and means absolutely nothing." That evening, as the church clock struck 8 and the last of the fog thickened over the river, Flaxborough settled into a contented hum of speculation. Every shop and parlour hosted its own theory. Every whisper added a new embellishment. Somewhere within the calm, respectable town, a truth moved quietly beneath the chatter, unseen, patient, and waiting to be recognized. Inspector Purbright preferred to let a mystery ferment for a day or two before prodding it again. By Tuesday afternoon, when he and Sergeant Love called once more on Mrs. Glossop, the town's collective excitement had matured into a well-baked pudding of certainty. Everyone now knew that the uninvited guest was someone's
cousin from Grantham, though whose cousin depended
largely on whom one least wished to associate. With Mrs. Glossop received the inspector in her parlour, with an air of benevolent martyrdom, as though she had personally borne the weight of Flaxborough's curiosity. A teapot steamed between them, and on a lace doily rested a plate of shortbread that might once have been cheerful. "I do wish people would let the matter drop," she began, stirring her tea with the solemnity of a judge. "It's becoming quite absurd. I only mentioned the handbag to Mrs. Frobisher, and now it's as if we'd hosted Mata Hari herself." Purbright smiled gently.
"Gossip, Mrs. Glossop, like ivy, flourishes best when pruned."
She considered this, not entirely certain whether it was a compliment, and went on. "Of course it is curious. I have asked everyone I can think of, and not one person recalls inviting that woman. You'd think a stranger would stand out?" "She did, according to several witnesses," said Purbright, examining his teaspoon as though it contained truth in solution. "Though opinions differ as to whether she was elegant, sinister, or foreign." "Foreign?" Mrs. Glossop's eyebrows rose with patriotic alarm.
"I hardly think so."
She moved perfectly properly.
"No flamboyance." "Ah," murmured Purbright, "that narrows it considerably." He sipped his tea.
"Might I ask, when you first noticed her? Did she seem to be alone?" Mrs. Glossop hesitated. "I believe so, though she might have spoken to someone during the raffle. I was rather busy managing the microphone. Did anyone mention a name to you?" "No, but I did overhear her say something about not staying long. At the time, I assumed she was leaving early. Now I wonder if she meant something else." Purbright's gaze rested thoughtfully on the handbag, which still occupied its shrine-like place on the mantel. "Has anyone called about it?"
"Someone claiming it?"
"Only Mrs. Jessup from the Ladies' Guild, and she wanted to borrow it for a costume. I told her firmly that it was police property." Purbright nodded with mock gravity. "A prudent decision. It's bad form to parade evidence before its owner reclaims it." He paused, allowing the silence to grow comfortable. "Do you recall anything unusual that night? Something small, perhaps? An argument, a misplaced item, someone behaving oddly?" She frowned, turning the thought over. "Nothing that would concern the police. Although—" Her voice softened. There was a small commotion near the coat room. One of the councillor's wives dropped her brooch. People were crawling about looking for it.
"I think it was found. Do you recall whose wife?"
"Councillor Wainwright's, I believe. A cat-shaped brooch. Gaudy thing, why?" "Oh, idle curiosity," said Purbright pleasantly. "It's a professional weakness." Mrs. Glossop refilled his cup, reassured by the flattery. She began to speak more freely about the evening. The raffle prizes, the minor triumphs, the gratifying applause when the mayor's speech finally ended. Purbright listened with the air of a man who could find enlightenment in the distribution of sandwiches. Love, less practiced, stared fixedly at the shortbread to avoid betraying boredom. When at last they rose to leave, Purbright thanked her for her invaluable assistance and promised to keep her informed. Outside, the air was crisp and edged with wood smoke. Love exhaled a long breath of relief. "Nothing new, sir," he said. "Just more about cakes and speeches." "Quite," said Purbright, stepping into the street. "Though sometimes the unimportant things confirm the important ones." "You noticed her hesitation when she mentioned the coat room?" Love blinked. "She hesitated?" "Only a heartbeat," Purbright replied, "but long enough to suggest that she remembered more than she cared to say. Either that, or the shortbread was unusually chewy." They walked on in silence, the late afternoon sun flattening into a dull gold over the roofs. The quiet streets of Flaxborough seemed innocent as ever, yet Purbright felt the faint, satisfying itch of complication beneath the surface. A stranger had come and gone, a handbag waited without owner, and somewhere a truth, small and sharp as a dropped pin, waited for him to step on it. By Wednesday morning, The investigation had reached that comfortable stage where everyone except the police was satisfied with the outcome. Constable Love arrived at Purbright's office with the confident air of a man who had found a solution that required no further thinking. "Sir," he began, holding a slip of paper, "I think we've identified the owner of the handbag. Belongs to a Mrs. Cora Phelps, visiting cousin of Councillor Wainwright's wife. Stayed at the Royal George Hotel for 2 nights, checked out Sunday morning." Purbright regarded him with mild interest. How very obliging of her. Did she also happen to lose her handbag in the precise manner required by the story? Love hesitated. While the hotel clerk said she was at the ball, or at least Mrs. Wainwright said she was.
They came in together, apparently. Purbright leaned back.
Mrs. Wainwright said so.
Not the clerk. No, sir, but she's reliable.
Wouldn't invent something like that? Purbright smiled faintly. Reliability, Love, is often the refuge of those who prefer tidy narratives. Still, let us be grateful for one. He folded his hands. Fetch Mrs. Wainwright in, if you would. We might confirm the family resemblance. By midday, Mrs. Wainwright had arrived, a small, precise woman whose nervous energy was disguised as confidence. She accepted tea, declined sugar, and adjusted her gloves as though they might give evidence against her. "My cousin Cora," she began promptly, "was visiting from Nottingham."
"I invited her to the ball, naturally."
"She must have misplaced her bag in all the excitement. I've told everyone so." Purbright inclined his head politely. "A thoughtful invitation, though I understand the guest list was managed by Mrs. Glossop, who doesn't recall including your cousin." Mrs. Wainwright's smile tightened. "Well, she must have overlooked it. These events are chaotic, Inspector, no doubt. And your cousin? Did she enjoy herself?" "She did, yes, though she left rather early, feeling unwell."
A headache. Purbright made a small note that might have been a doodle.
"I see. May I ask where she is now?" "Back in Nottingham, of course."
"I spoke with her on Monday." "Ah," he looked up.
"You'll forgive me, but the hotel records show that Mrs. Phelps checked out without paying her bill."
"They're quite upset." Mrs. Wainwright's fingers froze on her teacup. I can settle it for her, of course."
"She must have forgotten." "Very generous." Purbright smiled. "Might we have her address? Just to return her property?" She hesitated the briefest fraction of a second before reciting it. Purbright thanked her, promised discretion, and saw her out with his usual politeness. When she had gone, Love said, "That settles it, doesn't it? We'll send the bag to Nottingham and be done with it." Purbright glanced at the door. "You think so?" "Well, it all fits, sir."
Name, relation, guest list mistake. Makes sense. Purbright rose, moved to the window, and watched the slow passage of a milk van down the square.
"It does fit, but like a hat a size too small. One cannot help noticing the discomfort." Love frowned. "You don't believe her?" "I believe," said Purbright mildly, "that Mrs. Wainwright believes she has provided a sufficient explanation. That is not quite the same thing." Later that afternoon, Love made a telephone inquiry to Nottingham. The address Mrs. Wainwright had given belonged to an empty property, on the market for 3 months. No forwarding details, no tenant by the name of Phelps. When he told Purbright, the inspector only nodded as if mildly relieved. "Well, that clears the field a little. It's always dangerous when a case threatens to make sense too soon." He replaced the receiver and looked thoughtfully at the handbag on his desk. The faint perfume still lingered, a delicate scent that refused to fade, just as the truth did in these small, respectable places. Purbright opened the clasp once more, inspecting the folded invitation inside. It was identical to the others printed for the ball, save for one faint smudge near the bottom, perhaps a fingerprint, perhaps a careless thumb. He turned it under the light, smiled slightly, and closed the bag again. "Love," he said at last, "find out whether Councillor Wainwright's wife ever had a cousin in Nottingham. If she did, we shall apologize. If not, we may need to ask ourselves who Mrs. Wainwright was really covering for." Outside, the fog had begun to roll in once more, soft and familiar as secrecy itself. Flaxborough's windows glowed faintly in the dusk, each concealing its small domestic mysteries. And somewhere, beyond the comfortable clatter of teacups and conversation, a mask still waited to be claimed. The following morning brought a drizzle that seemed designed to discourage enthusiasm. Inspector Purbright, however, appeared impervious to weather. He sat at his desk examining the handbag for what must have been the fourth time. Each inspection yielded nothing new, which to him was oddly encouraging. Cases that revealed their answers too quickly rarely stayed solved. Encouraging. Cases that revealed their answers too quickly rarely stayed solved. Sergeant Love entered, carrying a small paper envelope. "Morning, sir." Constable Hopgood found this while checking the assembly room's garden. "Says it might belong to one of the ball guests." Purbright took the envelope and tipped its contents onto a blotter, a small bent brooch in the shape of a cat. One emerald eye remained, the other an empty socket. He turned it under the light. Not bad craftsmanship for something gaudy. Where exactly was it found? "Near the back door, sir, just under the laurel hedge." Hopgood thought someone might have dropped it on their way out. Purbright's expression did not change, but his tone sharpened by a fraction. "Under the hedge, not the coat room."
Interesting. He reached into his drawer and withdrew his notebook.
"Mrs. Glossop mentioned Councillor Wainwright's wife losing such a brooch, didn't she?" "Yes, sir. Said they found it that night." "Apparently not," murmured Purbright. He laid the brooch beside the handbag, studying the contrast between the tidy black leather and the damaged trinket. One very respectable, the other rather loud, yet they seemed to keep each other company. Love shifted, uncertain whether that was an observation or a conclusion. "Think it belongs to Mrs. Wainwright, after all?" "Perhaps. Or perhaps to the person she thought it wise to protect." Purbright leaned back, lacing his fingers. "Find out whether Mrs. Wainwright's missing brooch was ever repaired or returned."
"Ask at the jeweller's. Do it discreetly, no gossip if we can help it."
"Though I suppose that's like asking the tide to stop at the church steps." Love nodded and left. The drizzle thickened, tracing slow lines down the office window. Purbright gazed at the distorted reflection of the street beyond, the butcher's awning, the steady movement of umbrellas, the hum of ordinary life moving past mystery without noticing it. By afternoon, Love returned with his report. "The jeweller says no one's brought in a cat brooch for repair." But he did remember something else. 2 months ago, a woman came in asking about replacing a missing clasp on an identical design. Said she'd found it second-hand. Purbright's eyes lifted.
2 months ago?
"Yes, sir." Gave her name as Miss Elspeth Darnell.
"Lives well lived in the next village over."
Disappeared about 6 weeks back. "They say she went abroad suddenly." The inspector's gaze turned inward, as though reading a thought forming just beyond focus. "Abroad," he repeated softly. "Such a useful direction for the vanished." He rose, took up the brooch again, and examined its back. The metal was faintly scorched, as if it had lain against something heated.
"Tell me, love, what sort of person buys a trinket shaped like a cat?"
"Someone fond of cats, I suppose. Or someone fond of disguises," said Purbright quietly. He replaced the brooch and turned toward the window once more. "You see, love, the trouble with missing people is that they so rarely stay where they're told. They reappear in the oddest forms, uninvited guests, borrowed names, polite explanations." Love frowned. "You think the woman at the ball, Miss Darnell?" "I think," said Purbright, "that Mrs. Wainwright's cousin from Nottingham may have had a longer journey than she admitted." He smiled faintly. "And if so, someone in Flaxborough recognized her and preferred not to." As the afternoon waned into grey, Purbright took up his coat. "We'll visit the Wainwrights again tomorrow, but not to discuss handbags. People are far more truthful when you talk about something they consider trivial."
"Ask about their garden, their health, or their ornaments. Then they tell you what really matters." Love followed him out, still digesting the remark.
The fog was returning with evening, softening the street lamps and blurring the edges of the familiar. Flaxborough's shop signs glimmered dimly in the drizzle, respectable, complacent, and faintly secretive. Somewhere among them, A story was rearranging itself, quietly, deliberately, and just beyond sight. The morning mist clung low over Flaxborough, muffling sound and softening form. Inspector Purbright stepped through it as though walking inside a thought. He carried with him a quiet certainty that something, small, misplaced, seemingly harmless, was about to reveal its weight. The Wainwright residence stood aloof at the end of Beach Crescent, its neat hedges and polished brass speaking of a household that valued appearances above all else. Mrs. Wainwright received him in the drawing-room, draped in pale silk and civility. Her husband, Councillor Wainwright, lingered near the window, a figure of discomfort masked as patience. Purbright's greeting was gentle, conversational. He spoke of the fog, of the state of the roads, of the recent improvements in the council garden. Only when the small talk had comfortably wrapped around them did he let the first thread slip free. "By the way, Mrs. Wainwright," he said lightly, "I believe we've recovered something belonging to you. A brooch shaped like a cat." Her fingers tightened on her teacup. "Oh, that old thing. Yes, I lost it weeks ago. I'm surprised anyone bothered." Purbright smiled mildly. "It was found near the assembly room's hedge."
Curious place for it, wouldn't you say? Especially considering you thought it had been found already. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the delicate rattle of porcelain.
Councillor Wainwright turned his gaze from the window. "Surely there's nothing of consequence in that, Inspector. My wife may have been mistaken." "Quite possibly," Purbright agreed, his tone amiable but steady. "Still, it interests me. You see, another lady once owned an identical piece, a Miss Elspeth Darnell. You may remember the name?" The faintest tremor crossed Mrs. Wainwright's face, gone before her husband turned toward her.
"I can't say I do," she murmured. Purbright nodded as though accepting it.
"She disappeared some weeks ago. Went abroad, supposedly. A coincidence, perhaps?" He rose, brushing a speck of dust from his sleeve. "But coincidences in Flaxborough have an unfortunate habit of breeding." As he made to leave, he caught the reflection of Mrs. Wainwright's eyes in the mirror, sharp, frightened, calculating. She managed a polite farewell, but her composure wavered the moment the door closed. Outside, Sergeant Love waited by the gate. "How did it go, sir?" "About as one expects when people find themselves trapped between truth and reputation," Purbright replied. "She's hiding something and her husband knows it." "But he'd rather polish the brass than look beneath the tarnish," Love frowned. "You think she's covering for the missing woman? Or perhaps for the one who made her disappear?" Purbright paused, scanning the windows of the quiet street. "Either way, we're done with polite visits. Next, we look where the glass cracks." That afternoon he returned to the station and asked for the handbag again. There, under the faint stain on its lining, he found what he'd half expected, a trace of scorched fabric and a single thread of green silk. It matched the missing eye of the cat brooch. A small thing, but it made the silence between Mrs. Wainwright's words ring louder. He closed the case file softly. "Look, fetch the coroner's report from 6 weeks ago. Female, unidentified, recovered near the riverbank."
"I want every detail."
"And see if our jeweller remembers who purchased the other cat brooch. There were 2, there always are." As the lamps flickered to life across the fogged town, Purbright sat in his dim office, watching his reflection fade into the glass. Somewhere behind that mirror of rain and dusk, a truth waited, patient, cunning, and tired of being polite. It was just past 7 when the telephone on Purbright's desk trilled with the sharp impatience of bad timing. Sergeant Love, who had been wrestling with the paperwork of the riverbank case, looked up with mild dread. Purbright answered, his tone as calm as if the call had been expected. "Yes?"
"I see. When?"
"No, don't touch anything. We'll be there shortly." He replaced the receiver with deliberate care. He said, "was Mrs. Thistlewood. She's found something peculiar in her greenhouse." Love groaned quietly. "Not another stray cat, I hope." Purbright allowed himself the ghost of a smile. not unless the cat came wearing a lady's glove. By the time they reached the Thistlewood property, a tidy, ivy-clad semi on the outskirts of town, the dusk had turned the greenhouse glass into mirrors of mist. Mrs. Thistlewood, wrapped in a tartan shawl and indignation,
Led them to the back garden. There it was, she said.
pointing with a trembling hand on the potting shelf where I keep my begonias. A right fright it gave me too. Thought it was a hand till I saw it wasn't attached to one. The glove lay there still, pale kid leather, stained, faintly green from damp soil. Purbright picked it up delicately. Inside a faint perfume lingered, familiar, faintly floral, and unmistakably expensive. Love watched uneasily. "Same brand as the handbag, sir?" Purbright nodded slowly. "And likely the same owner, though what it was doing in Mrs. Thistlewood's greenhouse raises interesting horticultural questions." They thanked the woman and made their way back down the lane. The air smelled of smoke and fallen leaves, and the first lamps of Flaxborough's High Street winked through the fog. "I can't help thinking," said Love, "that whoever lost that glove didn't just drop it. Someone wanted it found." Purbright glanced at him approvingly. "A fair thought, Love. And if you were right, we must ask ourselves why." Back at the station, the constable on night duty handed Purbright a telegram. It was brief, and its economy of words lent it weight. Elspeth, Darnell, not abroad. Body found, Riverside identified. The inspector folded it without reaction. "So," he murmured, "the riverbank lady at last has a name." Love swallowed.
"That makes it murder, then?"
"Or the appearance of one," Purbright replied quietly. "Appearances have become rather busy in Flaxborough of late." He walked to the window, watching the mist drift through the lamps outside. A figure crossed the street, Councillor Wainwright hurrying toward the club. His gait, usually so deliberate, carried the anxious rhythm of a man whose peace was thinning. "Love," Purbright said, still looking out. "Have a word with the club steward tomorrow. I want to know whether Councillor Wainwright has received any unusual post."
Letters, parcels, anything uncharacteristically foreign or feminine.
Love raised an eyebrow.
"You think someone's blackmailing him?"
Purbright turned, smiling faintly. "Flaxborough has more forms of blackmail than varieties of geranium, Sergeant. Some are written in ink, others in silence." He returned to his desk, pen scratching quietly as he began a fresh page in his notebook. At the top, he wrote 3 names: Elspeth Darnell, Mrs. Wainwright, Mrs. Thistlewood. Beneath them, a single question mark. Outside, a church bell tolled the hour. In a town that prided itself on regularity, something irregular was gathering momentum, quietly, deliberately, like rot beneath paint. Purbright leaned back, eyes half closed. "The trick, Love, is not to ask what's been done," he murmured. "It's to ask who needs it not to be found out." Love, unused to such riddles, merely nodded. But the inspector's thoughts had already turned elsewhere, to a certain mirror, a frightened glance, and a brooch that had not quite told its story. Morning crept into Flaxborough with the caution of someone uncertain of their welcome. In the police station, Inspector Purbright sat alone in his office, the faint scent of old paper and tea leaves clinging to the air. His desk bore the evidence of an evening's quiet industry, files fanned like cards, each promising more confusion than clarity. He turned the telegram over again, reading its brief content as though expecting the words to have altered overnight. Elspeth Darnell, not abroad. Body found. Riverside identified. The confirmation did not surprise him. Rather, it settled uneasily into a pattern he had long suspected but could not yet name. From the outer room came the subdued murmur of Sergeant Love, awkwardly attempting to interrogate the typewriter into cooperation. Purbright smiled faintly. There was a certain comfort in such small sounds of bureaucratic normality, while murder tiptoed around the edges of civility. He rose, poured himself a cup of tea, and stood at the window. The high street below was slowly stirring, shopkeepers unlocking doors, Mrs. Hubbard arranging vegetables as if they were soldiers on parade, and a milk cart pausing outside the Wainwrights. The sight of that house, neat and self-conscious even from this distance, returned his thoughts to the woman who lived within it. He recalled her composure the previous day, the tremor behind the smile, the brief dart of her eyes toward her husband before answering. It had not been fear alone. There was calculation there, a struggle between silence and self-preservation. If Elspeth Darnell had indeed been part of her circle, something had passed between them that neither gossip nor grief had yet unearthed. Purbright set down his cup and drew the brooch from its evidence envelope. It glinted weakly in the morning light, a small cat with one missing eye. A thing of vanity, but vanity had so often been the hinge on which far heavier doors turned. He spoke softly to himself. What drives a woman to bury what she can't bear to lose and to dig it up again once it's safe to pretend? Love appeared in the doorway, holding a smudged carbon copy.
"I've got the jeweller's note, sir."
He sold 2 of those brooches about a year ago.
"One to Miss Darnell, one to—" He hesitated, glancing at the name. "Mrs. Wainwright said she wanted it to match her friends." Purbright accepted the paper with a quiet nod.
And so they matched, until one disappeared, and the other went missing by accident near the assembly rooms. You think she was there that night, sir? I think she's been everywhere she says she hasn't, Purbright said mildly. But we shan't rush to tell her so. Love shifted uneasily. What about Councillor Wainwright, then? He doesn't seem the sort to dirty his shoes with anything like this. Purbright's eyes held the smallest glint of amusement. No, love, he prefers others do his dirtying for him, though I begin to wonder if he's quite aware how much dirt has been swept beneath his carpet. He turned to the window again, watching the faint reflection of his own face against the glass. This case isn't about greed, or passion, or even hatred. It's about embarrassment, the most English of motives. Someone feared humiliation more than prison. There was a pause. Then quietly, he added, "And fear is the most untidy emotion of all." Love said nothing, but the weight of the words lingered as he left the office. Later that afternoon, Purbright strolled through the churchyard where the Darnell burial had been arranged in haste and discretion. The gravestone, not yet carved, was marked only by a small wooden cross and a wreath already browning at the edges. He stood before it, hands in pockets, the brim of his hat shading his expression. Somewhere a rook cawed, a sound dry as gossip. He thought of Mrs. Wainwright again, of her pale gloves and strained laughter, of her husband's restless watchfulness, and of the peculiar convenience of the glove appearing in a greenhouse that no stranger could enter unnoticed. No, the story had not finished telling itself. It was only choosing its moment. It was a raw and wind-shaken evening when Inspector Purbright decided the time had come for civility to take a slightly sharper edge. The Wainwrights, being both respectable and cautious, could be relied upon to attend the town's annual charity auction at the Assembly Rooms, an event where appearances were both duty and refuge. Purbright thought it a fitting stage for what he privately termed a polite disturbance. He arrived early, his manner that of a man hoping for nothing more serious than a mediocre supper. The hall was bright with chatter and the faintly oppressive perfume of lilies. Mrs. Wainwright, elegantly composed, stood among the raffle tables with her husband at her side, their conversation all smiles for the benefit of the mayor's wife. Purbright, drifting through the crowd, paused by the display of auction items, a collection of silverware, an oil painting of doubtful artistry, and, sitting rather incongruously among them, A pair of fine leather gloves sealed in a glass case. Mrs. Thistlewood, bustling proudly as a committee member, noticed him.
"Those were donated this morning," she said, lowering her voice.
Anonymous gift.
"Very genteel touch, don't you think?"
Purbright regarded the gloves with mild interest. "Indeed," he murmured, "though I wonder what manner of generosity arrives without a name." When the time came for bidding, Purbright positioned himself near the Wainwrights. The auctioneer, a cheerful man who mistook noise for enthusiasm, held up the glass case. Charming pair of ladies' gloves.
"Finest kid leather, fitted for the most delicate of hands. Shall we begin at 10 shillings?
There was the polite murmur of interest, the rustle of programs. Mrs. Wainwright, whose composure had not wavered all evening, turned the colour of chalk. Her husband glanced at her, confusion flickering, as she caught her breath with the smallest gasp. Purbright leaned forward slightly, his tone conversational.
"A handsome pair."
"You'd say they were well cared for, wouldn't you, counsellor?" The counsellor blinked. Yes, indeed." His eyes returned to his wife, now fixed rigidly upon the gloves, as if watching a ghost behind glass. The bidding rose in gentle increments until a final nod closed the matter. Purbright applauded lightly with the others, then excused himself toward the lobby. He waited there, knowing instinct and propriety would do the rest. Mrs. Wainwright came only minutes later, her composure brittle.
"Inspector," she began, voice low, "that display, those gloves, did you—"
He inclined his head slightly.
"I know, madam."
"Though it appears someone did. You seem affected. Were they familiar?" She hesitated, then said, "They looked rather like a pair I once owned." "It startled me, that's all." Purbright's expression remained benign.
"Quite understandable."
"Old things have a way of reappearing in unexpected places." Her eyes searched his face.
"You're enjoying this, aren't you, Inspector?"
He smiled faintly. "Enjoyment, Mrs. Wainwright, is rarely part of my work. Observation, however, is unavoidable." For a long moment neither spoke. Then, very quietly, she said, "You think I know something about Miss Darnell?" "I think," Purbright replied gently, "you know something about yourself and about what people might say if they knew it too." Her face paled, but she met his gaze steadily. "You have no proof?" "Not yet," he said. "But proof is rather overrated in Flaxborough. People often supply it for you if you leave them time enough to worry." She turned and walked away without another word, her steps careful, her posture immaculate. Purbright watched her go, then returned to the hall where Counsellor Wainwright stood alone, hands deep in his pockets, staring at nothing. Later, back at the station, Purbright found Love waiting with a report. "Post office confirmed, sir. Mrs. Wainwright received 2 letters from London last month. Both unsigned, same handwriting as the label on that glove case." Purbright took the note, nodding slowly. "And there we have it, Love. Fear has taken its pen to paper. Now we must see whose hand it was guided by." He looked toward the window where the fog pressed softly against the glass. "Tomorrow," he said, "we'll pay a visit to the woman who sells secrets for stamps." Morning sunlight crept over Flaxborough with the deceptive cheer of an apology. Inspector Purbright, hat in hand and expression unreadable, made his way to a small, uneven row of houses behind the post office, an area whose respectability had been retired for several decades. From one of these dwellings came the unmistakable aroma of boiled cabbage and opportunism. Mrs. Fenny, the postmistress's cousin and unofficial supplier of private information, received him with the brisk efficiency of a woman who knew precisely how valuable she was to local curiosity. Her parlour was thick with lace and stale air. "I do keep my ears open, Inspector," she said proudly, offering him tea that had clearly been steeping since dawn. "Purely for the sake of civic interest, of course." "I admire public spirit," Purbright replied mildly. "You've been helpful before, Mrs. Fenny, and I'm sure you will be again. Tell me, those letters to Mrs. Wainwright, the ones marked London, did you happen to notice who posted them?" She hesitated just long enough to suggest memory required encouragement. Purbright's glance toward her mantle, where unpaid bills lounged among ceramic cats, served as sufficient persuasion. "Well," she said at last, "I did think it strange. A lady in a dark green coat, rather tall, not from hereabouts." Came twice, same handwriting on both. The second time, she had a bruise on her cheek. "Paid cash for the postage." Purbright's voice remained gentle. "Did she say anything?" She asked whether the post went out promptly. I told her it always did. She smiled, well, almost smiled, and said, "Good, he'll know soon enough." The inspector inclined his head. "You've been most observant, Mrs. Fenny. You've earned the gratitude of the constabulary and possibly a quieter conscience." He left her frowning faintly at the last remark and returned to the station. Love looked up from his desk as Purbright entered. "We've traced that London address, sir."
Lodging house near Paddington.
Rented under the name Miss D, only stayed a fortnight, left owing a week's rent. "Miss D," Purbright repeated softly.
Elspeth Darnell, then.
Alive long enough to write letters designed to rattle Mrs. Wainwright's china, but dead soon after by the river. And someone helped her there? He sat down, folding his hands. "Love, fetch the counsellor politely. He'll want to cooperate, though he won't yet know why." An hour later, Councillor Wainwright stood in the office, pale and indignant in equal measure. "I fail to see why my wife and I should be dragged into this sordid business, Inspector." Purbright regarded him steadily. "Your wife is already in it, Councillor. The question is how deep, and whether you followed her or led her there." Wainwright blustered, then faltered beneath the weight of Purbright's silence.
She, Elspeth Darnell, was a family friend."
"My wife was fond of her." "Fondness," Purbright said quietly, "can take many forms. So can rivalry." Wainwright's hands tightened on his hat.
"You're implying something unspeakable." "Not unspeakable, Councillor, merely unspoken."
"Miss Darnell threatened exposure, didn't she? The letters were meant for your wife, not as torment, but as warning. She'd grown tired of pretending. But your wife couldn't afford scandal, not with your election looming. So she met Miss Darnell by the river. They quarrelled. There was a struggle. She slipped, or perhaps she was pushed. Either way, your wife walked home with a story she's still rehearsing." The councillor's face drained of colour. "You have no proof of that." Purbright's gaze moved to the brooch on his desk, the small cat, one eye missing. "Proof enough that someone was there who shouldn't have been. And the glove, found where no stranger could have left it. She hid it, then panicked and tried to make its discovery look accidental. But people who hide evidence seldom stop at one piece." Silence thickened between them. The clock ticked in disapproval. Finally, Wainwright's voice emerged, hoarse. "She didn't mean to. It was an accident. The woman was threatening to ruin us both. Letters, photographs, lies. My wife begged her to stop." She laughed. "There was a push. She fell." Purbright closed his notebook softly. "And you've been protecting her ever since."
"Admirable in its way."
"But the river remembers better than you do." Wainwright bowed his head. "You'll be gentle with her." "As gentle as truth allows," Purbright said. And more than justice usually is, that evening. As the councillor's carriage rattled away toward the magistrate's office, Purbright stood at his window, the town below settling into its quiet rhythm once again. Love entered softly. "You think she'll confess, sir?"
"She already has," Purbright murmured.
"Just not in words." He turned from the window, weary but composed. "Flaxborough will sleep well tonight, love. It always does after a scandal. It dreams cleaner than it lives." The next morning dawned grey and hesitant.
As though the sky itself wished to avoid witnessing what must follow.
Inspector Purbright arrived at the Wainwright residence just as the maid was opening the shutters. She started at the sight of him, clutching her apron as though it were armour. "Madame's not yet up, sir," she stammered. "That's quite all right," Purbright said gently. "Would you be so kind as to tell her I'll wait in the drawing-room?" He stood by the hearth, hat in hand, the tick of the clock loud in the fragile hush of the house. When Mrs. Wainwright entered, she was dressed impeccably, though her hands trembled slightly at the cuffs. The mask of composure she wore might have fooled anyone else, but not him. "Inspector," she said coolly, This must be important, arriving at such an hour. It is, Purbright replied.
Your husband has made a statement. I wanted you to hear it from me before the papers do. Her expression didn't change at first, but the faintest flicker crossed her eyes, like the twitch of a candle about to surrender its flame.
He's mistaken, she said softly. He's always been too willing to take the blame for others. Purbright's tone remained level. He didn't take it, madam. He shared it. The silence that followed was the kind that presses against the chest. She turned away, gazing out the window toward the fog that veiled the garden.
It wasn't meant to happen, she whispered.
Elspeth wanted money. She said she'd tell everyone. She laughed when I begged.
I only meant to frighten her. Purbright listened, his face unreadable. And when she fell?
Mrs. Wainwright closed her eyes. She didn't scream.
That's what haunts me most.
There was just the splash, and then nothing.
I thought she'd come up shouting, furious.
But the river took her, silent as a secret. He waited. The confession came like rain from a dark cloud that had waited too long to break.
I told my husband later.
He said we'd say nothing, that it would destroy us both. But I couldn't bear it. I sent the letters to myself to feel her near, to be punished somehow.
Foolish, wasn't it?
Purbright shook his head slightly. No, madam.
Merely human. Tears slipped through the fine armour of her restraint, tracing quiet surrender down her cheeks.
Will they hang me, Inspector? The law will decide that, he said gently. But it rarely finds joy in breaking what's already broken. She nodded once, then drew herself upright, smoothing her skirt as though preparing for a public engagement. May I have a few minutes alone? Of course. Purbright stepped aside, watching as she crossed the room with the dignity of someone who had nothing left to lose. When she returned, her gloves were on, her expression composed. I'm ready. Outside, the mist had thickened, softening the outlines of the world. As they walked toward the waiting car, she paused at the gate, looking back at her home. I suppose, she said quietly, the town will talk for years. It always does, Purbright replied. But in time it forgets the reasons, she smiled faintly. And that will be my mercy. They watched until the vehicle vanished into the fog. For a long while, neither man spoke. Then Purbright turned toward the market square, where shopkeepers were already sweeping their steps, the rhythm of Flaxborough life returning to its ordinary, oblivious pace. He straightened his coat and began walking back to the station. Another case concluded, another truth unearthed and quietly buried beneath the polite soil of the town. Yet, in the inspector's mind, the river still whispered, carrying away the echoes of a confession that had come too late to save anyone. As the car drove away, Love appeared beside him, hands in his pockets.
It's strange, sir. I keep thinking how peaceful she looked. Peace comes in many disguises, Love, Purbright said, his voice distant.
Some wear regret better than others.